Chicago winters had a way of pressing in on your chest, even when the snow hadn't started falling yet. The gray sky, the wet sidewalks, the cold wind whipping off Lake Michigan. It all wrapped around you like a damp blanket you couldn't shake off. But inside apartment 5B on South Prairie Avenue, warmth lived in quiet routines, a stocked pantry, and the humming of an old heater that clanked to life every hour on the hour. Calvin Brooks, 33, didn't mind the monotony. In fact, he leaned into it. After growing up in the unpredictable noise of Detroit, he had built a life in Chicago defined by structure. He liked rising before dawn, pouring exactly 1 tablespoon of sugar into his coffee, and ironing his shirts with military precision. His apartment was small, but clean. His life was simple, but full. And for the first time in years, he was in love. Her name was Danielle Harris. She was 31, a high school counselor who wore cardigans, always had mints in her purse, and listened with her whole body when someone spoke. He had met her at a friend's birthday party almost a year ago. One of those rare nights he had let Jackson, his college buddy, drag him out. Danielle hadn't been flashy. She didn't dominate the room, but she had a smile that reached all the way to her eyes and a laugh that made you want to lean in closer. She had asked him what he did for a living, and when he said electrical engineer, she responded, "So you're the guy that makes the lights stay on," and he had laughed in a way that caught him off guard. They were inseparable after that. They didn't fall in love fast. It was a slow build, coffee on Saturdays, dinner after work, watching old game shows together under a blanket. They shared the kind of intimacy that came not from fireworks, but from familiarity. Danielle would let out a small sigh when her feet hurt after work, and Calvin would have the heating pad waiting. He had a tendency to overwork, and she'd slide a glass of water into his hand like she was putting out fire. In January, she spent her first weekend at his apartment. By March, she had a toothbrush in his bathroom. And by the end of April, they were talking about moving in together once her lease ended in July. There were no secrets between them, or at least that's what Calvin believed. Danielle had mentioned once or twice that she had weird periods. Not irregular, exactly, just painful. Bad cramps. Sometimes they'd knock her out for a day. "Runs in my family," she had said with a shrug. "My mom used to curl up with a hot water bottle and a bag of frozen peas on her stomach. It's just how we're built." Calvin, ever the fixer, had gently encouraged her to see a doctor. "What if it's something else?" he had asked once, rubbing her lower back as she lay on the couch in sweatpants, her forehead slick with sweat. She had shaken her head and smiled. "Trust me, I've been living with this since I was 15. It's just part of the package." He hadn't pushed. She wasn't the kind of woman you pushed. And truth be told, he had his own quirks. Migraines that came out of nowhere and knocked him out cold. An old back injury from high school football. Everyone carried something. Still, sometimes he noticed things he didn't know what to make of. A faint odor, once, after they'd been intimate. Slight discoloration in her bedsheets. He didn't say anything. It felt impolite. Besides, Danielle always seemed fine afterward. No fever. No complaints. Just that same warm smile and a joke about needing to go grocery shopping. So he filed it away in the not my business folder of his brain. The one every man builds for things they don't understand, but fear might embarrass the woman they love. He didn't know that folder would be ripped open one night, violently and without warning. It happened on an ordinary Friday in March. He had a full day of meetings at work and had texted Danielle that he might be late for dinner. She had responded like she always did, with grace. "No worries. I'll cook at my place. Come over whenever you're done." By 8:15 p.m., he was knocking on her door, wine in hand and exhaustion in his bones. She opened the door in a black dress, her hair pulled up into a loose bun, and the smell of garlic and herbs flooded the hallway. He kissed her, handed her the wine, and let the quiet comfort of their life wrap around him. Dinner was perfect. Homemade pasta, soft jazz playing from a Bluetooth speaker, and 1,000 small touches that let him know she cared. Cloth napkins, candles, her favorite wine glasses, even though they weren't fancy. And afterward, when their dishes sat forgotten in the sink, and they moved to the bedroom with the ease of two people who knew every inch of each other's bodies. Calvin didn't know that what he was about to discover would change both of their lives forever. He just knew he was in love, and that the rest of his life was beginning. He had no idea that it might all unravel by the end of the night. The moment always began the same way, with Danielle's hand brushing his as she reached for the wine glasses, that quick glance that said not yet, but soon, and the tiny smile that curled at the corner of her mouth when he followed her into the kitchen. That Friday night was no different. Calvin watched her move around her apartment like she belonged in every corner of it. She had on that black dress he loved, the one with the open back that made him forget how tired he was. The pasta sauce simmered on the stove, rich and garlicky, and the jazz from her speaker made the room feel like an old movie, one where everything was still safe. Dinner was perfect. They laughed, they talked about her students. One had tried to fake a panic attack to get out of a math test, and she teased him about his obsessive spreadsheet folders at work. They were good together. The kind of good you don't question. The kind you just know. By the time the dishes were cleared and the second glass of wine was drained, Danielle leaned in and kissed him slow, the kind of kiss that needed no explanation. "Stay the night," she whispered. He nodded, already knowing he wouldn't be leaving. They moved through the darkened apartment with the quiet confidence of two people who'd memorized each other's rhythms. She reached in her nightstand drawer and pulled out a condom without a word, like she'd done a dozen times before. "Use this," she murmured, handing it to him. It was the same brand they always used. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. What happened next wasn't rushed. It was real. It was familiar. It was everything they had become, a couple in sync, completely themselves, with no space between their bodies or their hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the sheets, Danielle's head on his chest, their breaths slowly sinking as the buzz of wine gave way to the softness of exhaustion. "I can't wait for July," she said quietly. "Waking up next to you every morning." Calvin smiled and kissed her hair. "You sure you're ready for how bad I snore?" Danielle laughed, a soft, sleepy laugh that felt like home. "Please, I've survived your Spotify playlists. I can survive anything." They lay in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that feels earned. Then Calvin kissed her forehead and said, "I'm going to clean up real quick." He padded barefoot to the bathroom, flipping on the light and blinking against the sudden glare. He peeled off the condom and was about to toss it in the trash when something caught his eye. He paused. There was something, a strange movement, tiny, almost like he brought it closer under the light, confusion turning quickly into dread. At first, he thought it was lint, maybe a tear, maybe some kind of defect in the material. But then he saw it again, movement, definite, undeniable, tiny white shapes, wriggling, alive. He stared for a full second before his stomach turned, and he dropped the condom straight into the toilet. "What the hell?" he muttered, backing away, heart pounding. He flushed it immediately, as if the act alone would erase what he'd just seen. Then he stood frozen, staring at the toilet like it might give him an answer. Maggots. They had to be. No mistaking it. His hands were already under the faucet before his mind caught up. He scrubbed them with scalding water, again and again, the skin turning red beneath the friction. His reflection in the mirror was pale, shell-shocked. His heart was pounding so loudly he thought Danielle might hear through the wall. How do you even say something like that? He dried his hands, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the bedroom. Danielle was still curled under the sheets, scrolling through her phone with one hand, her other arm draped across the side of the bed. She looked up the second he entered. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Calvin sat down on the edge of the bed, his mouth dry. "There was something wrong," he said slowly, "with the condom." Danielle blinked. "Wrong how?" He couldn't bring himself to say it. There were things moving on it. She sat up straight, pulling the blanket around herself. "Wait, what?" "I know how that sounds," Calvin said, rubbing his temples. "But I swear, I saw. I think they were maggots." Danielle's face went pale. "That's impossible. Those condoms are new. I bought them last week." "I know what I saw," he said, voice strained. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Then Calvin said, "I think we need to go to the hospital." Danielle hesitated. "I feel fine." "Please," he interrupted gently, "just to be safe." She looked at him, saw the fear in his eyes, and nodded. Okay, she said softly. Let me get dressed. The emergency room at Chicago General was quiet, which felt unnatural. It was a Friday night, a time when the ER should have been humming with broken bones, bar fights, and bad decisions. But instead, Calvin and Danielle sat in the waiting room, surrounded by nothing but fluorescent lights and the low buzz of a mounted television playing the local news on mute. Danielle was wrapped in an oversized hoodie, her hair pulled back, face pale and drawn. Calvin sat beside her, legs bouncing, rubbing his palms together like he was trying to scrub off the memory. He kept replaying the image in his mind. The maggots, the slow, deliberate movement, the horror of seeing something alive where nothing living should have been. They hadn't spoken much during the Uber ride to the hospital. Danielle had leaned against the window, eyes unfocused. He had reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. At the check-in desk, Calvin tried to keep his voice low. We're here because of something that happened after intercourse. It's weird. We're not sure how to explain it. The intake nurse, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense vibe, just nodded like she'd heard worse. We'll get her in, she said. She'll be seen separately. He can wait out here. Danielle turned to him. You'll stay, right? I'm not going anywhere, Calvin said. 10 minutes later, she was gone, swallowed into the machinery of the hospital. Calvin was left staring at the empty seat beside him like it had something to say. Inside exam room 6, Danielle sat on a crinkling paper sheet, clutching the edges of her hoodie like armor. The walls were too white, the air too cold, the shame too loud. The door opened, and in walked Dr. Lisa Knight, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and rectangular glasses perched on her nose. Her presence was calm, almost maternal. Ms. Harris, she said with a soft smile. I'm Dr. Knight. I understand you're here for something unusual. Danielle hesitated. My boyfriend said he found movement on the condom after he had sex. Movement? He thinks it was maggots. Dr. Knight's face didn't flinch. She just nodded, flipping open a chart. Have you experienced any symptoms? Discomfort? Discharge? Odor? Danielle's cheeks flushed. I've had cramping, but that's normal for me. Sometimes it smells weird, but I thought it was just me. When was your last gynecological exam? Danielle looked down. Maybe 2 years ago. I've been busy, and I hate them. Understandable, Dr. Knight said. But let's take a look. I'll be gentle. Danielle changed into a gown. The examination table was cold and metallic beneath her. She stared at the ceiling tiles as Dr. Knight worked. Danielle tensed. Is something wrong? There's inflammation, and something unusual in the cervical canal. I need to run a culture. We'll also order an ultrasound, just to be thorough. When Dr. Knight stepped out, Danielle changed quickly and sat still on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped tight around herself. She didn't feel sick. She didn't look sick. But the doctor's expression, measured, concerned, wasn't something she could forget. Out in the waiting room, Calvin was spiraling. He tried Googling possible explanations. Bad condoms? Parasitic infections? Tampering? Each result made his heart sink lower. By the time a nurse called his name and took him to a separate exam room, he felt nauseous. His doctor, Dr. Robson, looked like he was fresh out of med school, tall, gangly, and trying way too hard to appear calm. There's no visible infection, Robson said after a basic physical. But we'll put you on a round of precautionary antibiotics, just in case. You should follow up with your primary doctor in a week. What about Danielle? Calvin asked. I can't share anything about her exam, the doctor replied politely. Privacy laws. I understand, Calvin said, but I'm not going anywhere until I know she's okay. Back in Danielle's room, the ultrasound tech arrived. The process was quick, but deeply uncomfortable. The screen showed black and gray swirls, pulsing textures, and strange shadows Danielle couldn't decipher. Afterward, Dr. Knight returned. There are signs of infection, possibly a rare one. I'm going to be honest with you, Ms. Harris. Based on what your boyfriend saw and what I found, I suspect myosis. Fly larvae. Danielle blinked. Inside me, it's very rare, and we still need tests to confirm. But it does happen, usually in tropical areas or in people with open wounds. I don't have any wounds. Do you use tampons? Danielle nodded slowly. That might explain entry, Dr. Knight said. But I also think you may have an undiagnosed condition that made your body more vulnerable. Like what? We won't know until we run more tests. Calvin was pacing the floor when Danielle was wheeled into a room hours later. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes sunken. Still, when she saw him, she tried to smile. They're admitting me, she said hoarsely. They don't know for sure yet. But it's bad. I'm staying, Calvin said without hesitation. You should go home. Get some rest. Come back in the morning. I'm not leaving you here alone. Just shower. Bring my stuff. He finally agreed, after she squeezed his hand and promised she'd call if anything changed. That night, Calvin couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the hospital room fresh in his mind. He could still feel the cold of that bathroom tile. Still see those tiny white forms writhing in the condom. And now they were inside her. He didn't know what the next day would bring, what the test would show, whether she would be okay. But one thing was certain. Their lives had already changed. By the time Calvin walked back through the automatic glass doors of Chicago General the next morning, the city had already shaken off its gray. A soft blush colored the skyline, the kind that hinted at spring, even if the wind still bit at his collar. He clutched a duffel bag, Danielle's favorite hoodie, a change of clothes, her moisturizer, and the paperback she always left on his nightstand but never finished. It felt like packing for a trip, only the destination was uncertainty. He found her awake, sitting up in bed, picking a hospital breakfast that looked more like punishment than nourishment. A tray of dry toast, runny eggs, and a half-hearted fruit cup. Morning, he said gently, setting the bag down and kissing her forehead. How are you feeling? Danielle looked at him for a moment before answering. Her face was calm, but her eyes were different, like something inside her had cracked and was trying hard not to spill out. Physically? Okay, I guess, she said. Mentally? I'm a mess. Calvin pulled the chair closer to her bed and took her hand. Have a doctor said anything? Danielle nodded slowly. Dr. Knight came in early. They ran the first round of tests overnight. The preliminary results, they're saying I have something called myosis. Calvin furrowed his brow. Is that? It's what you saw, she cut in, voice tight. Larvae, maggots, inside my body. He sat back, jaw tightening. How does that even happen? They think it's uterine myosis. Danielle said the words like they belonged to someone else. Apparently, it's extremely rare. Like textbook case rare. There are only a few documented in the U.S. Calvin shook his head. That doesn't make sense. You're clean. You're careful. Danielle's voice grew quieter. Dr. Knight thinks it may have to do with my menstrual issues, something I've had for years but never looked into. She thinks I might have some kind of underlying condition, something that made my body vulnerable, a place where the larvae could grow. The words hung there, disgusting and surreal. Danielle wiped a tear away quickly before it could fall. I should have gone to the doctor years ago, when the pain started, when I noticed the smell sometimes. I thought it was normal. I don't want to make a big deal out of something that every woman deals with. This isn't your fault, Calvin said firmly. Isn't it? She whispered. My body let this happen. I let it go this far. No, he said, gripping her hand tighter. You didn't know? That's not the same thing as ignoring it. There was a knock at the door before Danielle could respond. Dr. Knight stepped inside with another man, mid-60s, salt and pepper beard, horn-rimmed glasses. He looked like a professor, not a doctor. Danielle, this is Dr. Patrick Howard, Knight said. He's an infectious disease specialist. He's reviewed your case. Miss Harris, Dr. Howard nodded with a kind, professional expression. You're the talk of the hospital, I'm afraid. But I wish it were for a better reason. Danielle gave a weak smile. That makes two of us. I'd like to perform a more thorough pelvic exam, he continued. We also want to do an MRI to check for any internal damage or spread. Danielle glanced at Calvin, then nodded. Okay, I'll give you some privacy, Calvin said, rising. Danielle grabbed his hand before he could move. Will you stay after? When it's done. Of course. While the specialist worked inside her room, Calvin sat in the cafeteria downstairs, nursing a coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. The place smelled like disinfectant and overcooked eggs. Around him, people came and went, some smiling, some crying, all carrying stories of pain and hope and everything in between. He stared at his phone, resisting the urge to Google again. There was nothing he could read that would make any of this easier. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dr. Howard found him in the waiting area and asked him to return. Danielle was lying back in bed, clearly exhausted, but alert. She gestured for him to sit. "Well," he asked quietly. She swallowed hard. "It's confirmed. Uterine myosis." He exhaled through his nose, jaw clenched. "There's more," she added. Calvin's stomach dropped. "More." They also found something else. A condition called endometriosis. Calvin looked blank for a moment. It's when tissue that's supposed to grow inside your uterus grows outside of it, Danielle explained, her voice going clinical, robotic. It causes pain, bleeding, scar tissue. Sometimes it wraps around other organs. "How long have you had it?" They think for years. "Since I was a teenager." But it was never diagnosed. And it made this infection possible. Dr. Howard said it likely created a perfect storm. A warm, damaged environment. A fly may have laid eggs when I was using a tampon, during my period. And because of the endometriosis, the eggs had somewhere to live. Calvin was silent. Processing. Try not to picture it. Try not to scream. "They're recommending surgery," Danielle said finally. "Tomorrow morning." "What kind of surgery?" "They want to remove the larvae. Clean out the infected areas. Treat the endometriosis. Maybe remove part of my uterus. They won't know until they get inside." She choked on the last word, covering her mouth. "It might affect my fertility." Calvin stood up, pacing, hands on his head. "Jesus." Danielle looked away. "You don't have to do this with me." "What? I mean, if you want to walk away, I'd get it." "Don't say that," Calvin snapped. "This changes everything, yeah, but not us. Not me loving you." Her eyes welled up, but she nodded. "Okay." They sat together until nightfall. Her parents arrived from Milwaukee around 6 p.m., Barbara and Harold Harris, middle-aged, worried, sick, hugging their daughter like they could fix her just by holding on tighter. Barbara hugged Calvin too. "Thank you," she whispered, "for getting her here, for staying." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. That night, Danielle dozed on and off, sedated by pain meds. Calvin stayed by her side, barely moving, watching her breathe. At one point, she stirred and whispered, "Are you disgusted by me?" He leaned in close. "Never. I'm scared," she murmured. "So am I," he whispered. "But we'll get through it, one step at a time." And he meant it. No matter how dark it got, he wasn't going anywhere. Saturday morning arrived beneath a soft, coral-colored sky, painting the tops of Chicago's buildings in warm hues that felt cruelly out of place. Inside room 708, the tension was so thick Calvin could barely breathe. Danielle had been up since before sunrise, silent and restless beneath thin hospital blankets. She wasn't looking at him, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't trust herself not to cry if she did. Calvin stood at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, trying to look steady for her sake. In truth, he felt like he was made of glass. A nurse entered briskly, cheerful in that practiced hospital way. "Dr. Collins and the surgical team will be here shortly to prep you, Miss Harris," she said, checking vitals. "You'll be in pre-op by 8. Danielle just nodded. "Would you like me to call your parents?" "They're already on their way," Calvin said. When the nurse left, Danielle finally spoke. "You should go grab coffee." "I'm not leaving." She gave him a look, tired, knowing. "You'll need your strength. It's going to be a long wait." Calvin stepped to her side, bent down, and kissed her temple. "I'll wait forever if I have to." By 7:45 a.m., her parents had arrived, bringing a small bouquet of spring lilies and hugs that held on a second too long. Barbara's eyes were red-rimmed. Harold's jaw was tight. "I'm fine, Mom," Danielle said softly. "You don't look fine," her mother replied, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Well, I'm still here." Barbara tried to smile. Harold gave Calvin a quiet, firm nod, the kind men give when words feel insufficient. At 8 a.m. sharp, Dr. Sarah Collins entered the room, flanked by Dr. Knight and a younger physician Calvin didn't recognize. She looked composed, no nonsense, with auburn hair pulled into a tight bun and a tablet in her hand. "Miss Harris," Dr. Collins said, "we've reviewed all your scans and blood work. We'll be performing a laparoscopic procedure today. That means a few small incisions rather than one large one." She laid it out like blueprints. "We'll remove the larvae and infected tissue. We'll also address the endometriosis, excising as much as we can without damaging critical organs." Danielle's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "What about my uterus?" Dr. Collins paused. "Our goal is to preserve as much reproductive structure as possible. But depending on what we find, there's a chance we may need to remove part of the uterine lining or, in extreme cases, perform a partial hysterectomy." Danielle looked away, blinking fast. Calvin felt like someone had kicked him in the chest. "How long will the surgery take?" Barbara asked. 3 hours. 4 max. And after? If all goes well, 2 to 3 days in the hospital. 4 to 6 weeks of recovery at home. Danielle nodded. Okay. The goodbye was harder than expected. Her parents kissed her cheeks, muttered prayers under their breath. Calvin waited until it was just them. She looked up at him with wet eyes. "What if I wake up and it's all gone?" He squeezed her hand. "Then we rebuild. Whatever we lose, we'll face it together." She gave him a fragile smile. "You always say the right thing." He leaned in close and whispered, "You've got this." Then they wheeled her away, and the door shut softly behind them. The surgical waiting room was a sad kind of quiet. Muted walls, coffee machines humming, chairs built more for function than comfort. Calvin sat between Barbara and Harold, all three of them silent, staring at different fixed points as the minutes crawled by. Barbara knitted. Harold checked his watch every 10 minutes. Calvin couldn't sit still. He stood. Saturday. Walked to the window. Back again. 2 hours in, Jackson, Calvin's college buddy, and the one who had introduced him to Danielle, showed up with a tray of coffees and a bag of breakfast sandwiches. "You didn't have to come," Calvin said, surprised. "Didn't feel right not coming," Jackson said. "She's family, man." They sat down in the far corner, away from the tension, and Jackson asked the question Calvin had been dreading. "What exactly is she having surgery for?" Calvin hesitated. Danielle hadn't told him to keep it private, but it felt sacred somehow. "It's complicated," he said finally. "A rare infection, and something she's had for years but didn't know about. She'll explain it when she's ready." Jackson nodded, eyes serious. "Whatever it is, she's lucky she's got you." Calvin didn't feel lucky. He felt helpless. At hour 3, Dr. Knight appeared, her expression calm but serious. "The surgery is going well," she said. "They've removed all visible larvae and infected tissue. Dr. Collins is now addressing the endometriosis. Danielle is stable." Barbara broke down in tears. Calvin exhaled for the first time in hours. "Another hour, maybe a little more," Knight said. "Dr. Collins will speak with you once it's over." By the time Dr. Collins returned, the waiting room had shifted from tense to suspended animation. She still wore her surgical cap, gloves removed, her face marked by the kind of exhaustion only hours in an operating room can bring. "The surgery was a success," she began. "We were able to remove all infected areas. The infection was significant, but contained. That's the good news." "And the endometriosis?" Calvin asked. She sighed. "It was more advanced than we hoped. Stage 4. It had spread throughout the pelvic cavity. We excised what we could. Some areas were too close to vital organs to remove safely." Barbara clutched Harold's hand. "As for her reproductive organs," Collins continued, "we preserved the uterus, most of it. One fallopian tube had to be removed. The other is intact. Both ovaries are functional. So, can she still have children?" Barbara asked softly. Collins hesitated. "It's possible, but won't be easy. She'll likely need the help of a fertility specialist. And even then, we can't promise anything." Calvin closed his eyes. Not relief, not grief, just reality. "She's in recovery now," Collins said. "You can see her soon. She'll be groggy. Won't remember much tonight." An hour later, Calvin walked into room 733 and saw her. She looked smaller somehow, pale, fragile, tubes in her arms, monitors beeping gently around her. but her eyes opened when she heard the door. "Hey," she whispered. He sat beside her, took her hand. "You did it," he said. "You made it through." Her eyes flickered. "Everything. They got it all," he said. "One tube gone. Uterus mostly okay. You're still you." Danielle gave a ghost of a smile. "Still me, huh?" He leaned closer. "Always." The first night after surgery passed in slow motion. Danielle drifted in and out of medicated haze, her eyelids fluttering like they were too heavy to lift. Calvin stayed by her side the entire time, crammed into the stiff hospital recliner, his legs numb and back aching. But he didn't care. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the heart monitor's steady rhythm his only comfort. Every beat meant she was still here. Every breath meant she was still fighting. At some point past midnight, her voice broke through the darkness. "Are you disgusted by me?" The question was barely above a whisper. Calvin leaned forward, startled. "What? No, never." Danielle didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, glazed but aware. "I would be," she murmured, "if I were you." Calvin reached for her hand, which felt warm but fragile. "You're not what happened to you, Danielle. You didn't ask for this. You didn't cause it. And it sure as hell doesn't define you." A tear slipped down her cheek, trailing slowly toward her ear. "I feel like something broken," she said. "Something invaded me, made me unclean." He shook his head slowly. "You're the strongest person I know." Danielle turned to look at him, then really looked at him. In the dim light of the hospital room, her eyes were red, rimmed with pain, but they were clear. "And if I can't ever have children?" Calvin didn't blink. "Then we'll figure that out together." Her expression faltered. "You've always wanted a family." "I've always wanted you," he said. "Whatever comes with that, I accept." By Sunday morning, the pain began to settle into her body like old furniture. Not sharp, but present. A dull ache in her lower abdomen. A constant soreness that made every shift on the bed feel like a chore. But the fog began to lift, and with it came questions. Barbara arrived mid-morning with fresh clothes and a thermos of homemade broth, her way of reclaiming control over the chaos. Harold stood at the window most of the time, silent but steadfast. Jackson stopped by that afternoon, bringing her favorite juice and a soft blanket. "Damn, you really know how to scare people," he said gently, placing the items on the tray table. Danielle smiled faintly. "You always said I was dramatic." Calvin watched from the corner, grateful for the moment of levity. Danielle needed the laughter. They all did. That evening, Dr. Collins returned to check her incision sites and explain next steps. "You're healing well," she said. "The infection is completely removed. No signs of further complications so far." Danielle nodded. "And the endometriosis?" Collins exhaled. "We got what we could. But it's chronic, Danielle. It'll need monitoring. There's no real cure, just management. Hormone therapy, pain management, and possibly more surgeries later on." Danielle closed her eyes for a long moment. "Can I still get pregnant?" "There's a chance," Collins said honestly. "But it won't be easy. You'll likely need help. IVF, maybe even surrogacy down the line. And if I don't do any of that, then you'll still have a full life," Collins said. "Just a different version of it." That night, when her parents had left and the room was quiet again, Danielle turned to Calvin with the kind of expression that comes only after you've hit rock bottom and survived it. "I know this is a lot," she said. "I know," he replied. "I won't hold it against you if you need to leave." Calvin looked at her like she'd slapped him. "Don't say that." She swallowed. "I mean it. You didn't sign up for this. For me being half fertile, half functional." "Stop," he interrupted. "I didn't fall in love with you for your uterus." Danielle stared at him. "I fell in love with the woman who spends her weekends mentoring kids who remind her of herself, who laughs at my bad jokes, who takes up half the bed and all the covers and still manages to look beautiful doing it." His voice grew quieter. "You're not broken. You're not a burden. And if the only way we ever build a family is with 2 dogs and a porch swing, I'm still in." Danielle covered her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that escaped. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." By Tuesday, the nurses began talking discharge. She was healing better than expected. Her vitals were strong. She could walk, slowly, down the hallway with Calvin holding her elbow like she might tip over. They gave her a thick packet of instructions, prescriptions, follow-up appointments, and referrals to specialists. But it all felt like a blur. The real work, the emotional aftermath, had only just begun. At checkout, Barbara cried again. Harold offered to drive them both home, but Danielle insisted she wanted a ride with Calvin. The city looked different from the car window. Sharper somehow, like everything had been recut in higher resolution. She kept one hand in Calvin's lap the whole ride. That night, Calvin helped her into bed, fluffed the pillows, arranged her heating pad, and made her tea. Danielle lay back, exhausted but comfortable. "I missed this bed," she said softly. "I missed you in it," Calvin replied. They lay there in the quiet for a long time. Then Danielle said, maybe, I want to talk to someone. A therapist?" She nodded. "I think that's a great idea," Calvin said. "We can go together if you want." Danielle reached over, touched his cheek. "I don't know what's going to happen to us," she admitted. "But I know I want to try." Calvin kissed her palm. That's all I ever wanted. Outside their window, the city buzzed. Horns, footsteps, sirens, life. But in that little room on the 7th floor, a new kind of silence settled over them. Not heavy, not fearful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that means healing has begun. In the end, it wasn't the surgery or the diagnosis that defined them. It wasn't the maggots, or the word myosis printed in bold letters across the hospital discharge papers. It wasn't the hours Calvin spent in a waiting room, pacing a rut into the tile floor, or the ache in Danielle's body as she learned how to heal from something she never saw coming. What defined them was what happened after. The quiet mornings, the slow walks, the tears in the kitchen when Danielle stood too long and her stitches pulled, and Calvin dropped everything to help her sit. The first time, they made love again. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to reclaim something that illness tried to take away. What defined them was resilience and choice. Danielle chose to speak up, to see doctors, to attend therapy, to talk about what happened not like a horror story, but like a lesson. A warning to other women who dismissed their pain, ignored their instincts, or feared embarrassment more than consequence. Calvin chose to stay, to listen, to love her not in spite of what she had been through, but because of how she had survived it. They never forgot what brought them to the hospital that night. How could they? Trauma leaves fingerprints. But over time, it became something else, not a scar but a seam, something that held them together. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, Calvin and Danielle slowed down. They gave themselves permission to grieve, to grow, and to rewrite what their future could look like, even if it didn't include biological children, even if it wasn't the version they once imagined. Because in the end, survival isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about becoming someone stronger, someone who wakes up each morning, looks at the person beside them, and thinks, "We're still here." And that's more than enough.